Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here and congratulate the organisers on this conference, on the scale of the conference. I think it marks a new step in the study of Turks in Europe. And I was pleased to be at a conference a year ago in Berlin, which was presided over by the Deputy Prime Minister of Turkey, which marked 50 years of the guest worker scheme, the arrangement between Germany and Turkey. And so it's great to be here to be thinking about the next 50 years. My talk isn't about Turks, nor actually about migration, but about about multiculturalism and integration. That's to say, when Turks are no longer primarily migrants in Western Europe, but are citizens, as of course many are today, but increasingly a larger proportion, I think, will be. And you'll see from the slide that I've slightly changed the talk to emphasize that subheading, struggling with confusions. Because I think when we talk about multiculturalism and integration, in just about any European country today, there is a lot of confusion. And what I'd like to do in my presentation is to help to move from confusion to some degree of clarity. Clarity and advocacy, because I do see myself as an advocate of multiculturalism. But I do think that if all we get out of my talk, if you get out of my talk, is some clarity, something will be achieved. And what I want to offer to achieve that clarity is a conceptual framework for understanding integration and multiculturalism. So I want to say that there are 4 modes of integration. That's if you like, my conceptual framework, the basic part of it. But I want to say that when I talk about integration in this talk here, I'm not talking about what we might call sectoral integration. That is to say, for example, integration into the labour market, or integration into a particular locality. And I'm not talking about what people talk about as everyday integration. The locality and the everyday has become very popular in social science. And I do think we do need to study, as it were, the micro, but I think we've gone a little too far in the direction of the micro, and I want to emphasize understanding integration at a more macro level, in particular at a national level. And I think that integration, despite what, the sectoral and everyday aspects of it, is incomplete if we don't think about a sense of membership and belonging. That is to say, to citizenship. So those are the 4 modes of integration I'm going to talk about, but I'm going to talk about them as aspects of integration into citizenship. I'm sure you'll all recognize this 3 bullet points here, the famous slogan of the French Revolution. I think that we should all agree that these are actually the 3 central concepts of liberal democratic citizenship. But there are many different ways of understanding the concepts, and I couldn't possibly go into all those different ways. What I want to argue, however, is that each of the modes of integration that I've just mentioned, and I'm going to speak about for the rest of the talk, that each of these 4 modes of integration can be understood in terms of, as it were, their take on these 3 central concepts of citizenship. I think that that's the best way of trying to understand the modes of integration, to understand them in terms of liberty, equality, and citizenship, because they each are offering some degree of understanding on 1, 2, or 3 of these concepts. And their limitations as a mode of integration also emerges through applying these concepts to that mode. So let me begin with the first one, assimilation. So assimilation is where difference is a problem, is seen as a problem, because it's seen as leading to discrimination and conflict. So how do you deal with that? Well, on this model, you say, let's make everybody the same. Treat everybody the same. They should have the same rights. We can see that that is an interpretation of the concept of equality. Moreover, assimilation normally presumes a strong, homogeneous national identity, which is what people are being assimilated into. And we can see that that is an understanding of the concept of fraternity or unity. But what about freedom? What's the role of freedom in our understanding, or in any understanding of assimilation? Well, I think that one could say that assimilation offers a freedom from minority difference. If people feel the weight of difference that they carry and wish, as it were, they weren't so different, then assimilation allows people to, as it were, put down some of that weight, to be like other people, to not be so different. So there is an element of freedom, but it's a freedom from something. But what it isn't is the freedom to be different. If that's your choice, if that's what you want to do. Assimilation has no space for freedom to be different, even though it allows a certain kind of freedom. Even worse, actually, its understanding of equality is far too limited. It's flawed. Because assimilation assumes two classes of citizens. It assumes citizens who are normal, who are the main body of citizens, and it assumes a second group who have to become like the first group because they're not sufficiently like the first group to begin with. So the first group don't have to do anything. They just be themselves. Or maybe, as it were, they display what it is to be a good citizen, what it is to be normal. It's the second group that have to do all the work to be like the normal citizens. So that's created two classes of citizenship, which is inimical to the idea of equal citizenship. So I think that assimilation does have something to say, which we shouldn't ignore, about integration, but it is a flawed mode of integration. So I turn to the second mode of integration, which to some extent remedies the defects of the first mode. Each of my four modes I present it as trying to meet the defects of the previous mode. Individualist integration. So that sees that one-way change, as assimilation clearly is flawed because it does not meet the basic standard of equality. And so it says, yes, there's two-way change. The new citizens, they have to change, fair enough, but society as a whole has to change and adapt to the new citizens. It's not only one group of citizens who do all the changing, even though the burden of change may still vary, it won't be completely symmetrical. Above all, in individualist integration, it recognizes that the majority society and institutions must be made inclusive, because the normal situation is where these institutions are discriminatory against some classes of people. Classes of people marked by colour, classes of people marked by national origin, classes of people marked by religion, and so on. So anti-discrimination, active anti-discrimination is necessary on this model, especially in socioeconomic integration, in order, as it were, for the majority society to carry out its contract, its part of the bargain, what changes it has to make, while asking others to change as well. Moreover, unlike the assimilation mode, this mode recognizes one can't be different blind. How can we even recognize discrimination if we say everybody is the same, as they say in France, for instance, where it's unlawful to ascribe ethnicity to French citizens, so it actually makes social science a little bit difficult and sometimes unlawful, though the law is not strictly enforced, thank goodness. But a lot of good French social science, and there isn't that much of it, but what is good is unlawful by at least Anglo-American standards. But on this model, it recognizes we have to count, for instance, how many people of certain ethnic groups are in employment or are in better paid jobs. And we have to see from time A to time B whether we have improved the level of representation. So we can't be different blind. In order to fight to have equality and fight racism, for instance, you have to recognize difference. Moreover, on this model, at least in a country like Britain, we have moved from firstly focusing on racial equality, as we did in the 1960s, 70s and 1980s, to recognizing that religious equality, too, needs to be within this mode of integration, within this concept of anti-discrimination. And this mode of integration also has a fraternity concept, a unity concept. And its unity concept is a national, liberal, democratic citizenship. So in many ways, there are attractive features and recognizable features of this mode of integration. But difference is presumed to be negative. On the whole, in this mode of integration, difference is something that the dominant majority imposes on minorities. The dominant majority imposes an ascribed ethnic characteristic or a racial characteristic. It assumes that if only we could fight that, if we could make that unlawful or change majority attitudes and behavior, then actually difference wouldn't really exist. Or it would be just so private that it wouldn't be a public matter. And the next mode of integration meets that issue. This I call cosmopolitanism. Some people call it things like everyday multiculturalism or multiculture, because this takes a more positive and active notion of difference and of subjectivity. It says difference isn't simply other people judging you by the color of your skin or by your accent. Our sense of understanding can be the basis of our difference. We may think we have an identity that we want to cultivate with other people who share that identity, co-ethnics or members of one's community or religious group, and we want to pass this identity on to the next generation, our children. So difference isn't something we just, as it were, legislate against in order to prevent discrimination. Difference is something that we may want to live, but not in a static way. We recognize that this difference is changing, and that we're not trying to preserve difference in a pure way. A lot of difference, when, especially a city like London, where people's differences is constantly interacting with other people's difference, and flowing and borrowing and synthesis becomes the normal patterns of interaction. And on this model, no one is to be defined by their origins, not by the majority, but nor by their own community. So we don't just say, oh, the white majority must stop racializing individuals. We also say that within a community, people shouldn't say, oh, you're not Turkish enough. Come on, be Turkish, be like me, or Pakistani, or black, or whatever it might mean. On this mode of integration, we recognize that freedom also means freedom from community pressure, not just from majoritarian norms of behavior. And therefore, this is a mode of integration which positively nurtures, values, and encourages new and multiple identities. Now, isn't that a very attractive model? I certainly find it attractive, but I don't think it is enough. I don't think it is fully satisfactory. Why not? Well, some people have stronger identities. They don't see themselves as just multiple and mixed free-flowing and changing and say, well, in some situations I'm Turkish, in other situations I'm a chartered accountant, and in third situations I'm a mother. For some people, some identities are stronger, more primary, more pervasive, more weighty than other identities. They don't just juggle all the identities up in the air. And this may be partly contextual, because obviously if everybody in the majority of society, in the media, and in your workplace is always pointing at you and say, oh, that's a Muslim, oh, hello, how are you, nice to meet a nice Muslim like you, and so on, then it's very difficult to say that somehow, oh, Muslim is just one part of me, when all the time that is what you're being faced with. Clearly, your own consciousness will be shaped by those societal pressures. But it needn't only be pressures from the outside. People can, through their own choices, through their own collectivities, nurture their identities, come to put some identities above others. And if we allow, as we clearly do in countries like Britain, France, Germany, America, and so on, if we allow people to organize on the basis of identities like economic class, trade unions, workers, business groups, professional associations, and we allow people to organize on the basis of national or regional identities like, Yorkshire or Scottish or Welsh. We allow people to organize on the basis of gender identities, like, for instance, the Labour Party has an autonomous women's group with its own conference and budget and so on. Then why pick on post-immigration identities? Why pick on these minorities' identities formed through migration? Why not allow individuals to organize on the basis of those identities as well? It gives people power, confidence to participate in the wider society if they feel they are welcomed as they are and are not being asked to, as it were, hide something about themselves, to leave something about themselves in their homes, which is because it's not welcome in the public place. But we do have to recognize that there is a very big multi, as I have at the bottom, which now then brings us to the fourth mode of integration, which is multiculturalism proper, what I'm calling multiculturalism. You'll see that what I call multiculturalism is not what everyone else calls multiculturalism. For instance, it's clearly not what Chancellor Angela Merkel calls multiculturalism. What she calls multiculturalism, I would call guest worker apartheid. The idea that Turks have to live over there and have to send their children to those schools and so on, which she says is a failed policy, has utterly failed. I agree, that has utterly failed. But that's not because multiculturalism has failed. Germany is one of these countries that has moved from pre-multiculturalism to post-multiculturalism without even knowing what multiculturalism is, without having even tried it. And it's not the only country in Europe, so I don't want to exceptionalize it, but it is one of the worst cases. So what about multiculturalism? So I want to emphasize that multiculturalism is a mode of integration. It's not the opposite of integration. It's not the problem that integration is trying to solve. It is a mode of integration. In particular, it addresses the deficits of the other modes of integration. And it addresses the democratic deficits, that is to say, the deficits understood in terms of liberty, equality, and fraternity, that the other modes of integration, good as they may be, valuable as they may be in certain respects and in certain contexts, don't fully capture. So in multiculturalism, we recognize there are different bases of identity. For example, colour. A lot of people say they're black and proud. For other people, their national origins can be very important. Britons are an example of people who went all over the world and kept alive, nurtured their British identity wherever they went, whether it was to India, or Australia, South Africa, and so on. And there are lots of groups like that, not just with the Brits. For other people, a linguistic community is very important. The Chinese, for instance, the Chinese diaspora is global and historic, it's not just recent, and wherever you find it, you find Chinese people teaching young children to speak Chinese. Often, if you look at the Indian diaspora, for instance, the Indian diaspora in the Caribbean, places like Trinidad and Guyana, they have lost Hindi to a very large extent, not entirely. But for them, what's important to pass to the next generation, and they've been doing so for 3, 4, 5 generations, is their religion. For Jews, it's been their religion that they've passed on to the next generation. They've only just made Hebrew a priority just in the last 2 generations. But for the previous 2,000 years, it was their religion that was central to their identity. So different groups will have different identity bases. So we shouldn't have a single identity basis for our understanding of multiculturalism. Moreover, there are different kinds of identity because members expect different things of each other. For instance, black people expect of each other that they stand up and support each other against racism and discrimination. But they don't say, oh, you're not really black if you have a white girlfriend or a white boyfriend or a white husband or a white wife. There are other communities, my family's from Pakistan, a lot of Pakistanis say, actually, you should marry a fellow Pakistani. That is what we expect of you. So different communities have different ideas of what it is to be a member of that community. And we shouldn't, again, impose one single idea of community or minority. And none of these should be privatized. We shouldn't privilege some identities which we say we welcome and celebrate, and others we will just tolerate. If you don't put it in front of our faces, we'll tolerate you. Others, will have celebrations. The local authority will find some monies to have a fair or a pride or a march or something like that, but there are some other identities that we don't really want to know about. No, if these identities are important to fellow citizens, then those citizens have the same right as everyone else to make the public space together with other identities, with other priorities and so on. And that really is the basis of the next bullet point. The importance of equal respect. And this model of multiculturalism, which is a real multi, can involve informal and formal representation. A lot of people seem to be nowadays against ethnic groups or religious groups representing themselves in civil society, or even worse, to government. Like Muslims speaking to government. You get lots of public intellectuals and commentators saying, no, if you want to speak to government, join a neighbourhood association or a trade union or a political party. That's how we speak to government. Well, we don't have to. There's no prescribed model. New groups will have their own way of doing things. There was a time when there was no such thing as a women's group, but that was a long time ago. If Muslims want to organise around their Muslim identity and ask the government to speak to them on the basis of that, the government has no right to say, no, sorry, we don't speak to faith communities. I mean, democracy is where the governed choose forms of representation, and the governors are supposed to be the listeners and the actors on behalf of the governed. On the other hand, I don't want to say that there are no problems with multiculturalism, because I think we're all aware of what the problems are, if only because all the newspapers are so full of them. Every day of the week we hear about inward-looking communities. There's a lot of suspicion and fear, and of course international terrorism gets involved in that, very especially breeding conflict. Though a lot of the fear and suspicion is nothing to do with terrorism. It's often anxiety about cultural threats. There was a project in the School of Journalism in Cardiff University a few years ago. They analysed all the stories about Muslims in the British newspapers over a certain period of time. Let's say they took a 2-year period, 2006 to 2008. That was the sort of period. So they analysed all those stories, and when they started the project, their expectation was that the dominant theme would be about terrorism, suspicion of terrorism, security stories, things like that. And what they found, and these were negative stories about Muslims. They had a few positive ones, not many, but they did have a few positive ones. But when they analysed the negative ones, actually, the stories that were the most numerous in the negative stories about Muslims were all to do with cultural and religious threat. Whether it was about what women chose to put on their heads, or it was about people wanting to pray or build a mosque. Those stories outnumbered in the English press stories about security. The security stories only dominated at particular moments of time, when there was a particular incident, obviously like a bombing or a court trial, something like that. And so I understand also that community cohesion, why it has become an important policy feature in a number of our countries, including in Britain, locally. But given what I said earlier, that integration is incomplete without a national focus, I want to emphasize that an important part of multiculturalism is actually national identity. And I don't think that this is a particularly perverse point of view of mine. Most multiculturalists, if you study them closely, I'm thinking of people like Charles Taylor, William Licker, Beacon Parek, most of them emphasize national identity making and remaking as an important component of multiculturalism. And the country that has the most developed policy of multiculturalism, Canada, right from day one, i.e. the late 1960s, early 1970s, said we need a policy of multiculturalism because we need to build Canadian national identity. But this national identity, of course, can't be top-down. That would breach complete understanding of multiculturalism. It must bring people together, but not give them a single model that they have to conform to. And the state shouldn't decide what the national identity is. And it must avoid stigmatizing any group of citizens because they're not being sufficiently British, or they're not really Germans. It should be plural and forward-looking, because of course national identities carry a lot of history, and we can't, just like that, wipe that out. The history is part of a national identity, but national identities should also be forward-looking as well as honouring their past. Why? Why do we need a concept of national identity within a multiculturalist mode of integration? Because after all, isn't citizenship about belonging? Surely it's about fraternity. So can't citizenship be our unity? Why do we also need some kind of nationality, some national identity? And I think the answer to that is that citizenship for most people, most of the time, is a very dry concept. For those of us who are very politically conscious or politically active, it can mean a lot. But to a lot of ordinary people, for most periods of time, it means very little. Passports, voting once every 5 years, and so on. And so we do need something which is more emotional, which grabs people's sense of being, and above all, grabs their imagination. Something like a national story, or national symbols and ceremonies, celebrating on a national day and so on, to bring us together. So what we need is a national citizenship, a sense of national identity which is constrained by the concept of citizenship. Obviously, citizenship must do a lot of the work, and citizenship means liberty, equality, and fraternity. So we need a national identity that is consistent with liberty, equality, and fraternity. And that, I think, actually is the mode of integration within which we can do justice to whatever is valuable within assimilation, individualistic integration, and cosmopolitanism. Because people should be allowed to assimilate. That should be their choice. We shouldn't stigmatize those who prefer assimilation to emphasizing difference. That would be ridiculous. But wanting to be different should also be a respected choice. We should be able to have both. And that's why I think of multiculturalism as the more encompassing mode of integration, which allows the other modes of integration their due while going beyond their limitations. Thank you.